Albrecht and his 6 companions reached the Arktos Ridge Mountains as the sun was beginning to set. No further attacks occurred as the Kodiaks pushed into the more treacherous mountains. Albrecht was familiar with the Arktos Mountains. His father had taken him hunting in this range before, and he'd helped survey the area for the mining guild as a young man. They had dug a number of tunnels to test to see if there were any valuable materials underneath the sharp peaks. The survey was a failure, but Albrecht knew where at least a few of the tunnels were that they could use to survive through the night. The sun was setting and the snow was steadily falling when they reached the tunnel. "We'll stay here for the night. Let's pile up some snow at the entrance. This will help prevent the heretics from using thermal detection to find us. Meet the snowfall. We have a good chance that our handiwork will be disguised as a natural snowdrift. Let's get to work." Albrecht and his men quickly built a snow wall with their entrenching tools to block the entrance of the cave. The worst thing that could happen is that the snow wouldn't hide their tracks well enough, and the heretics would march through the night to find them. It was a risk Albrecht was willing to take. Wandering around the mountains in the dark with rapidly dropping temperatures was a good way to get yourself killed. Albrecht hoped his enemies had had enough sense to stop their pursuit and seek shelter, or if they continued, that the Arktos Ridge would make corpses of them all. The Kodiaks set up camp a little ways into the tunnel. It wasn't very deep, but moving away from the entrance reduced the likelihood that their lights would be seen through the snow. The men began to relax a little bit. They had lost friends, but there seemed to be a general feeling of relief that they would be able to get back to Ursus Station soon. Wilhelm, Lucas, Mikko, Karl, Frederick, and Jarmo were the only ones left of the original 12. Albrecht smiled as they spoke quietly to one another and shared a meal. There were somber moments for the loss of Exeli, Alexander, and Tuevo. There were toasts to Alvar and Pavo, who were likely safe and sound at Ursus Station by now. Albrecht sighed as he thought about tomorrow. As the commander, it was for him to worry about the heretics still chasing them. It was for him to worry about the things that might yet go wrong. For his men, now was a brief respite before bed, a moment where the war didn't exist, and they could simply speak to one another as men. Albrecht took first watch as they settled down for the night. At first light, Albrecht's men emerged from the tunnel. There were no disturbances during the night. They hadn't been found. Now, it was less than a day's march through the snow to Ursus Station, and they seemed to be home free. It took a little while for the Kodiaks to dig their way out of the tunnel. Fresh snow blanketed the mountains, but it was a light powder and easy to move. The Kodiaks emerged one at a time and began the final leg of their journey. With their snowshoes preventing them from sinking deep into the snow, and a spring in their step, the men began climbing the Arktos Mountains. Albrecht knew the old rocky paths, but it would not be an easy march. They would still need to be careful. The snow could conceal cracks and crevices, and one careless step could send them tumbling down the mountainside. After a few hours, Lucas raised his fist to halt the men. They were all marching silently to avoid giving away their position, and also to avoid more avalanches. Albrecht stood beside Lucas as he pointed to a thin strip of smoke climbing into the sky. The commander's face became grim as they made their way to the top of the ridge to get a good look at the source of the smoke. The Kodiaks reached the crest of the lesser mountain. They would need to climb their way through one more mountain pass before reaching Ursus Station, and Albrecht feared what he would see down in the valley. The commander let a sigh escape through his nose as he pursed his lips. Down below, blocking the pass, was the heretic camp. They must have known the basic geography of the mountains. Perhaps they had captured some unfortunate locals, but it seemed as if the heretics had marched through the night to reach that pass. They knew the Kodiaks had to pass through it. It was undisciplined of them to start a fire, but the heretics were likely fighting frostbite and hypothermia at this point. Had Albrecht and his men continued to follow the path instead of climbing the ridge, they likely would have been caught by the traitors. From what he could tell, the fire had been started out of desperation. With his magnoculars, Albrecht could see their numbers had greatly diminished. Whether some had turned back or the mountain had claimed them, Albrecht wasn't sure. but they were about half the number that they had faced when they escaped from their wrecked chimera. Still, even if these filth were hungry, freezing, and dying, they all likely could still pull a trigger, and 50 against 7 was still extremely bad odds. Albrecht was missing Pavo's long las at this point. Albrecht moved his men forward skillfully and silently. They would need to find a good piece of cover that would be difficult for the heretics to assault and overwhelm them. The commander saw a rocky outcrop that would serve them well close to the camp. From there they would have excellent cover. The traitors would have to wade through deep snows to close the gap. Albrecht still wasn't sure exactly how to clear the enemies from the path. The best he could hope for was some kind of foolish charge. If they all tried to move over the open land to assault the Kodiaks, they could be picked off one at a time. It was the best shot they had. Albrecht and his Kodiaks carefully moved towards the rocky outcropping, making sure to stay below the ridge line. When all 7 were in position, they waited patiently, taking careful aim, waiting for their commander's order. Fire! The Kodiaks began firing on the heretic encampment. 3 of them dropped immediately, and 2 more fell as they scrambled to respond. Hands grabbed for weapons, and the traitors scurried for cover. Now the stalemate began. There were still more than 40 enemies between the Kodiaks and their path of escape. If the traitors merely held their ground and stayed behind cover, there would be no way for the Kodiaks to realistically break through. However, neither could they kill the Kodiaks either. In a way, the Kodiaks had time on their side. They were better equipped, they had warmer clothing, and likely had enough rations to last longer in the cold. If the heretics didn't force this final confrontation, the mountains would eventually take them. Albrecht thought for a moment. If only he could get a little closer, he could throw grenades into the enemy cover and force them out into the open. Then he had it. He had an idea to end the stalemate and force the heretics into a proper confrontation. Continue firing. Give me a moment. Albrecht removed both of his snowshoes. If the heretics attacked now, he would have to fight without superior mobility. There was no retreat anymore. But still, it was worth the risk. Albrecht loosened the mesh near the toe of his snowshoes to make a kind of pocket at the end. He then placed a grenade with a little pouch and its cap still on, and he gave it a little flick to test it. It worked as intended. The snowshoe could now act as an atlatl to hurl grenades. When his men realized what their commander was doing, they began handing him all their frag grenades. With lasfire filling the air, Albrecht hurled the first grenade. The grenade landed just to the right of one of the barricades, and with a muffled explosion, 2 more heretics hit the ground, crying out in pain. Albrecht continued to use his grenade atlatl as a mortar, angling his shots to circumvent enemy cover. They had nowhere to go. They could either try to scale the mountain, exposing themselves to lasfire, or they could try to assault the Kodiaks over the open snow. They chose the latter. With their dark masters urging them forward, the pawns of chaos surged forward with screams that made the Kodiaks nervous. The last thing they needed was an avalanche blocking their only path out of the mountain. Such concerns were secondary to making these heretics feel the wrath of the Emperor. As they ran forward, screaming their blasphemies, the Kodiaks were more than happy to grant them the Emperor's mercy and send them to their dark masters. Lasfire seared through the air as the heretics began dropping like flies. They were slow-moving targets flailing through the snow, and it was like shooting fish in a barrel. Still, the 7 lasguns of the Kodiaks might not be enough. 5 more fell as they drew closer. With the shorter range, the enemy fire was becoming more dangerous. Yarmo was struck in the head by a lucky shot from one of the raving lunatics, and that was 1 less gun. The remaining guardsmen intensified their fire, bringing down another half-dozen. At this rate, they would be overrun, even if the enemy suffered catastrophic casualties. With superheated energy blasts and stubber fire flying through the air, Albrecht had a moment of painful regret. He thought that he could lead his men out of the mountains safely. And now their corpses would belong to the Arktos. They likely wouldn't even be found until spring. He was happy that Paavo and Alvar at least made it home safely. This moment of sadness passed, and was replaced with a resolute determination.
Keep firing, men. If we are to die this day, we will die bravely serving the Emperor. Let it be known that every Kodiak is worth 10 of these so-called chosen of the Dark Gods. They came into the bear's den, and we made them bleed for it. For the Emperor! For Ursus!
It was at that moment that a familiar sound could be heard over the snow. Cresting over the mountain path and streaking down to the heretic camp were a dozen snow tracks, each loaded with fresh Kodiaks ready to spill blood for the Emperor. They must have seen the smoke rising from the traitor camp as well. A few of the enemy paused as the reinforcements arrived, but many of them continued their bloody assault on Albrecht and his men. Lucas stood, turning his lasgun to full auto and firing it into the swarm of traitors. He took many with him, but after numerous stubber and las rounds struck him in the chest, his flak armor gave out and he collapsed into the snow. He gave his life, but he had broken the final assault. The snow tracks were running down what was left of the cultists as they finally broke and ran, abandoned by their gods. Albrecht collapsed on the outcrop, his heart pounding. He prayed that the souls of Lucas and Jarmo found their way into the Emperor's embrace, and he thanked the Emperor that he and his men had been allowed to survive another day, to fight again in his glorious name. Hail, Albrecht's Kodiaks, for the Emperor, and for Ursus.